Today's text comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, verses 51 through 56. In your pew Bible, it is on page 843. And today's sermon title is called Turning Points. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead of him. On their way, they entered a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. But they did not receive him, because his face was set towards Jerusalem. When his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" But he turned and rebuked them. And then they went on to another village. The word of the Lord. They went on to another village. Today we are celebrating the triumphant entry. The day when Jesus entered Jerusalem and the people shouted, "Hosanna." They celebrated the coming of this Jesus who had been speaking, who had been healing, who had multiplied food, who had been doing God's work. He was coming into Jerusalem, and they were celebrating him. That's what we celebrate in this day. But this text is a little farther back. It takes us to before he came into Jerusalem, but it takes us to the moment when he turned his face and looked towards Jerusalem and said, "Now my time has come." And his journey from here forward is heading towards Jerusalem. And if you know the Gospel of Luke, there are about 24 chapters in the Gospel of Luke. And here we are in chapter 9. So from chapter 9, at this point in chapter 9 forward, it's all the final days, weeks, maybe a couple of months of Jesus' ministry. So everything that we see and hear from this point forward is not part of the first 2.5 to 3 years of ministry. It's just the final portion of his ministry. And everything that we see and hear is so much happening in just this small amount of time. He turned his face towards Jerusalem. He had come to the point where it was time to accept and to do what he had come to do. He accepted the purpose that he had served. He was God who had given up everything and came to be here with you and with me. Or I should say, like you and like me. To be a normal human being. To walk, to talk, to be a part of community. To be like we are. Jesus came to be just like us. But now he reached a point where he could no longer run from or avoid what he was called to do. It was time to turn towards Jerusalem and to get there. And he knew what was awaiting for him there. He knew the trouble that was coming. He knew the pain that was about to come, and yet he still turned. And he still came towards Jerusalem. And as we see, his disciples weren't always the most kind-hearted or humblest of folk. Like when they start their journey to Jerusalem and they go to a Samaritan village and the village says, no, we don't want him. There's no room at the inn here. You can't come in. And what's the first thing they want to do to that village? They ask him if we can call down fire, if we can call down fire from the sky to consume them. How awesome would that be? To be able to call down fire. Please, Jesus, let us call down fire. Let's burn them. And Jesus says, no, we continue forward. It's easy to want to just destroy the things that cause us trouble. It's easy to want to call down fire on those who may not see the things like we see them. It's easy to want to crush our opponents into dust so that they won't bother us again. It's easy to want to do that. But is that the thing that needs to be done? Is that what God has called us to do? is that how God has called us to live. If you listen to the world today, if you listen to those in control and in charge, you might hear you have to step on another to get to where you want to get to. But it doesn't seem like that's Jesus' way. Even though this village didn't want him, he didn't want to call down fire and crush them. For he knew that his purpose was even for them, even for those who rejected him, even for those who were not allowing him in. He was still heading to Jerusalem to do what needed to be done. How difficult is that? It's hard for us on a given day to just do the things that we need to do. It's hard for us on a given day to just want to get out of bed and want to go to work and want to do the things that need to be done because the bills need to be paid. These are the things that we have to do, and we struggle with it. How difficult is that? Now imagine Jesus, as he had given up everything, as he had given up eternity, as he had given himself, he poured himself into a body to be like us, and now he has to go to this final phase. To go into Jerusalem knowing that they're going to celebrate him and say how great he is on Sunday. And by Friday, they'll be shouting, "Crucify him." Even though he knew that, he still turned towards Jerusalem. And he still went forward. And now the funny thing is that he could have just avoided Jerusalem altogether. He could have just made the circuit around all the towns and villages around Jerusalem and in the area and continued to preach and gather 5,000-10,000 people. He could have preached from town to town and made money and done well for himself. He could have continued to feed people and to heal people and to continue to encourage people. He could have done these things. He could have lived a longer life by just being a preacher around the way. He could have just continued to do what he was doing, avoiding Jerusalem altogether. But yet, he turned towards Jerusalem. He turned his face towards the goal he knew he had to accomplish. And he journeyed to that place. How many of us are willing to do that? As we consider turning points in life, as we consider Jesus knowing where he was going, what was going to happen, how he was going to suffer, he still turned and went to where he needed to. How many of us are willing to make that choice? How many of us are willing to see where we are, where we know we shouldn't be, doing the things that we shouldn't do? And I'm not saying that you're doing anything bad. It's just that we know that we are not doing what God has called us to. We know that we are not fulfilling the thing that God has called us to do. We know that we could be doing better, but yet we continue on the same journey, suffering the same things, complaining about the same things, and worrying about the same things because we would rather do that than to turn towards the goal that we know we should be turned towards and walking towards that. It's not an easy thing. Jesus didn't look towards Jerusalem and say, "Awesome, this is going to be great." He knew it wasn't going to be. And he knew the journey there was going to be tough. And when he got there, it was going to be tougher. But how many of us are complaining about our situations and circumstances? How many of us are wishing we could do something else? Wishing we can be someone else? Wishing we could be doing something that was more encouraging for us, something that brought more hope to us, something that's different, because where we're at now is just not cutting it. How many of us are willing to turn towards our Jerusalem and leave our past behind? Leave the things that we're struggling with. behind. Leave the life that was, that doesn't do anything for us anymore. Jesus could have kept on the circuit, village to village, town to town. But at some point, he wasn't benefiting anyone by avoiding what needed to be done. If Jesus continues to preach, continues to heal, continues to feed, and dies a good old man at 90 years old, he might be remembered as a good teacher who lived once. He might be remembered as someone who brought hope to people. He might be remembered for someone who did something 2,000 years ago, but it would be just a blip in the history books, maybe. But that wasn't his call. His call was greater. He knew that he needed to go to Jerusalem. He knew he needed to walk into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, the smallest and worst of all horses. A donkey, which is like unimportant in terms of what a horse is. The King of Kings, the one who would change all of human history, walked into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. And they celebrated him. And he could have changed it. If he would have had a sword, he could have lifted a sword, and they would have loved him even more because they knew that he was the Messiah who was going to fight for their freedom, and they were going to conquer Rome. They were going to be free by force. If he was willing to do that, they would have followed him. But that wasn't his call either. He could have spoken up, taken the crown, and said, yes, I am the King of the Jews. I am the Messiah. I am the one who is going to free us. And they would have loved him for it, but that wasn't his call. He could have come in and just done what he wanted to, but that wasn't what he was called to do. And that was a difficult thing. How many of us would be willing to give up power in that way in order to sacrifice ourselves so that these same people who cheered you on Sunday and shouted crucify on Friday can find freedom and relationship with God? How many of us would be willing to give ourselves up for that? It's not that easy, right? We remember Jesus as the divine that he was and is. But we also have to remember the human and the humanity of Jesus. He struggled, I'm sure, with this. It wasn't as easy as we sometimes portray it to be. He probably struggled because he realized he was giving up his life by heading towards Jerusalem. But because he accepted the call, because he responded to God's call, because he did what was needed to be done, because he accepted what needed to be done, we are here 2,000 years later, part of one church that is part of many churches that make up the body of Christ in the world today, because of his choice. How many here are willing to turn towards their Jerusalem? To look away from what was and look at what God is calling you to do? How many of us here are willing to stop the same cycle from occurring over and over again and then complaining about it? How many of us are willing to turn and look towards our Jerusalem and not only look but start to journey towards our call? To do what God is calling us to be what God is calling us to be, to encourage, to strengthen, to be the people that God is calling us to be. How many are willing to do that? It means you got to leave those old things behind. It means you have to leave the life that was. That life is done. It's already done. The fact that you keep trying to resurrect it doesn't make it alive again. It's done, and it's time to move forward. It's time to look forward. It's time to live into the call that God is calling us into now. How many of us are willing to accept that? This is our turning point. This is your turning point. Just as Jesus turned towards Jerusalem, just as Jesus started to walk towards Jerusalem, just as Jesus turned and left his what he was doing behind, doing it on the way to Jerusalem, but not worrying about his long life, not worrying about how he could benefit from all that's happening, but focused on doing the call that God had called him to do. How many of us are willing to do that, to be that, to accept that? Today, God is calling you to a turning point. It's time that you turn towards your Jerusalem. It's time that you turn towards where God is calling you to. Stop trying to make the road that you're on work because it's done. Stop trying to resurrect a life that is already dead. Stop trying to keep going in the cycles that you are because all you do is complain about it. It's not where you need to be. God is calling you to turn towards your Jerusalem and start on the road to come. For it is on that road, it is in that journey that we become the people of God that God is calling us to. That we become the encouragement that we want to be. That we become the spark of hope that others need. That we become the people who are needed in this world. In our own family, in our own community, in our own church. We become the person and the people who need to be here. Rather than being a complainer about what was and what I want and how I want it to be again, we can become people of encouragement by looking to what God is calling us, by turning towards where God is calling us, and by doing the work that God is calling us to now and here. But are we willing to turn towards our Jerusalem? Today is your turning point. Are you willing to turn?